The Italian Wine Podcast is the community-driven platform for Italian wine geeks around the world. Support the show by donating at ItalianWinePodcast.com. Donate €5 or more and we'll send you a copy of our latest book, My Italian Grape Geek Journal, absolutely free. To get your free copy of My Italian Grape Geek Journal, click Support Us at ItalianWinePodcast.com or wherever you get your pods. Grazie mille.
Welcome to Masterclass US Market with me, Juliana Colangelo. This show has been designed to demystify the US market for Italian wineries through interviews with experts in sales and distribution, social media, communications, and so much more. We will quiz each of our esteemed guests at the end of each episode to solidify the lessons that we've learned. So sharpen your pencils, get out your notebooks, and join us each week to learn more about the US market. Hello, welcome to Masterclass US Wine Market. Today, I am thrilled to welcome Robert Camuto to the Italian Wine Podcast. Many of you are probably familiar with Robert. For those of you who aren't, Robert is a contributing editor to Wine Spectator since 2008, where he writes a twice-monthly column. And he also is an award-winning and prize-winning American author and journalist, and he's lived in Europe with his family since the onset of the 21st century. Robert, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Great to be here, Juliana.
Absolutely. So today we're going to dive into a little bit more about what makes really intriguing storytelling in wine journalism. And this is a topic we've been exploring on the podcast in a few various episodes, because I think it's really important, especially as the consumer changes and we need to find new ways to communicate around wine. But before we dive into that topic, Robert, tell us a little bit more about your own journey in journalism and how you came to really focus on wine and storytelling in your work today.
Well, I'm a career journalist, and I've been a journalist since like 1981, writing magazine features on the West Coast for, at the time, a punk new wave magazine in all different outlets. And then I went mainstream after graduate school and worked in Texas newspapers for quite some time, the Dallas Times-Herald, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, covering everything from, politics to arts features. And then I started my own weekly newspaper in Fort Worth, Texas. It's called FW Weekly or Fort Worth Weekly. And it still exists. It's still around. At the time when I started, it was the largest market in the U.S. that didn't have an alternative weekly. And in Fort Worth, Texas, an alternative weekly is not the easiest thing to do. People are always not interested in alternative points of view. Yeah, but we did that. And then after about 5 years, I discovered I really don't like being a manager. I like being a creator. And I sold the paper and I moved with my family, our son was 7, to France. And in journalism, we have a saying, follow the story. Follow the story. That's kind of what you do. In following the story in France from 2001, there was a whole kind of eruption of the wine scene at that time towards regional wines, rejecting the idea that only, French wine was only Bordeaux and Burgundy. And you had a great explosion of regional wines all over, from the Loire to the Rhone to the Southwest to Alsace, everywhere. And I found that to be really exciting. And I started kind of following that, wrote a book about it called Corkscrewed, Adventures in the New French Wine Country, that came out in 2008. And more, I just became intrigued by the idea of the way wine recreates itself. And this is a story we see throughout the wine world. That same renaissance that was happening in France, then maybe in Italy, started a few years after that. We see those tendencies in Spain, in Greece, everywhere now, where you have, new generations. Maybe the parents did not work in wine. The grandparents did. The parents became teachers or something like that. And you have a new generation that's going back in and kind of rediscovering what they have in the lands, what they have in their cellars, and trying to valorize and maximize that. And, that's pretty exciting to me. I mean, wine scenes make exciting wines. And so I've just been following that. And
So it was that story of recreation that really intrigued you in the beginning when you first moved to France to focus in on the wine space for your niche with journalism.
well, to me, it just seemed like, okay, well, they're interested in things like wine, olive oil, travel. And wine was a very dynamic, sort of happening story at the time. You had the first natural wines
Right.
coming out that scene with all its excesses, I must say. But it was always interesting. And, it was a moment of foment. And so it made for interesting stories, interesting people, and interesting tales. So,
Absolutely. And how did you end up writing for the Wine Spectator? Tell us a little bit more how you came into that position.
okay. Well, about the time that my first book was coming out, I contacted the Wine Spectator. Previously, I wrote a lot of travel and gastronomic type pieces for the Washington Post and other publications. But it just sort of happened at that time in about 2008. And I must also add, too, that after 15 years in France, about that, in 2015, moved our home to Verona, Italy. And, where I'm focusing more on, Italian wine that's having this very interesting period, in my opinion, in all of its regions, in all 20 regions.
And what would you say is your general approach to your column with the Wine Spectator, taking into consideration, the long career you have in writing and in journalism? How did you think about approaching the column that you're still penning today?
Well, it's called Robert Camuto Meets. And I think that kind of sums it up, because I think one of my fortes, no matter what I covered, was always writing about people. I'm super interested in people, what makes them tick, what makes them excited when they get out of bed in the morning. And so interviews and profiles have always been kind of my thing. With the column, however, I try to really mix it up. So some of it is winemaker profiles. Some of it it could be about a wine scene, a group of people, a new approach to a certain grape in a new region. It could be something kind of more newsy. It could be opinion. For example, I've developed a lot of opinions about the rosé boom, which I see in some ways, having lived in Provence, largely as a travesty. We could explore that if you want, or people can check out some of my pieces on that. And in some cases, it can be just interesting people doing interesting things, i.e., whether it's a eccentric actor like John Malkovich, or recently, one of my pieces that'll be coming up is about a property in the Piedmont called Mura Mura. I was really interested in that because the founders are actually the guys, it's two of them, who started Grom ice cream. What's interesting about that, it's a super interesting circle because Guido Martinetti, who was kind of the idea man, the founder, the farmer, researcher type, his original degree was in enology. He grew up in the Piedmont, loved wine. To him, Angelo Gaia was God. And he had a sort of a epiphany one day when he was out snooping around in one of Gaia's vineyards in Barbaresco, when he picked up a newspaper in a cafe after lunch, and there was an article by Carlo Petrini of Slow Food saying, why isn't ice cream made like it used to be made? And so the whole idea that started growing this huge, 200 store chain throughout the world was, well, what if I made ice cream the way Angelo Gaia makes wine? That would be interesting. And so they did that for a number of years, and then they sold that company to Unilever, I think in 2019, and they invested that to go back into wine.
Very cool. And how do you, Robert, you talked about people being what intrigues you the most when it comes to storytelling. How do you ask the right questions or pull out the most intriguing, interesting stories from your subject?
I would say I always like to hear people's story. Their personal story is always fascinating. But I would say my basic idea and philosophy as far as storytelling is this, because there's a lot of, I would say, maybe not so great storytelling and not so great stories in the world of wine. Classic example, well, tell, the generations, what your
We've all heard
grandfather,
that, yes.
And yeah, some of that can be interesting. It's great. But to me, wine is culture, period. Simple stuff. So when I approach wine, what I want to know from people, if I, for example, hear from a wine rep or a PR agency, it's like, oh, you should come, taste these wines. I'm like, okay, well, what's new here? How is the culture being advanced? And I'm always interested to hear that. So if people talk about, well, we've got this grape and we're trying to revive it. Okay, but what are you doing? What research? How are you working in the vineyards with that? How are you doing things differently? What are you? So, I think, again, wine is culture. It starts with agriculture. They call it agriculture for a reason. They don't call it ignorance. They call it agriculture. And so, these kinds of things are very interesting. So like going back to say Grom, it's interesting to start that story sometimes in the vineyards. I mean, do these people know what's going on in their vineyards or no? Or is that for, somebody some crew they hire and they cut the vines and all that? So when you have some winemakers who maybe their approach is to absolutely have the smoothest expression of their grapes in their wine, what you sometimes find is like the way they cut the wines in summer, affects that. In other words, instead of just trimming, like they, have perfect little shrubs like they do in Napa, no, they roll the tops. So it puts the vine under less stress and creates less bitterness in the fruit. So those are like little kind of things, attention to detail, that is important and goes beyond, well, I got this great machine, I got this great enologist, etc.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like you're doing something different and really tailored in your approach that suits your space and connects maybe back to your larger region. Like you said earlier, it's agriculture. How do you fit into the culture of your region, your family, your story? And Robert, you mentioned earlier on in the episode, you've been living in Verona since 2015, and you've seen this new wave and new renaissance in Italian wine specifically, and then this new generation. Talk to us a little bit about what you mean by that, what you're seeing, and what's really intriguing to you right now about this new generation in Italian wine specifically.
Well, I think that, like in some cases, where you have areas that are underappreciated and undervalued. And, the game, it seems to me, and the story behind the storytelling is how can people valorize their territory? So that seems to be, the real story behind the whole Italian Renaissance, wine Renaissance, which may have started, say, for example, in the 80s, in the Piedmont and Tuscany, Gaia. And now we see that, spreading to all different areas. So I almost hesitate to not talk about it, Mount Etna in Sicily, which is a subject I know quite well, having written my book, Palmento, Sicilian Wine Odyssey, which came out in 2010, and having seen the early phases of the Etna Renaissance boom. I say I almost hesitate not to talk about Etna because it's so, held up as this wow, success story. But I think what happened there is, before 20 odd years ago, Etna Reds, in particular, weren't that great. They were sold in bottles that, to tourists with, that looked like lava or something like that, really cheesy. I mean, they weren't really oriented to quality. But it took certain people coming in from outside, Andrea Franchetti from Tuscany, Marco Di Grazia from Tuscany, California, wherever, Frank Cornelissen coming from Belgium, joining with other locals who've been there before, Salvo Foti, who worked for Benanti, people like Giuseppe Russo, Girolamo Russo, Alberto Gracci, Ciro Biondi. I mean, the list goes on. So I think that really created an interesting, exciting scene of a generation that was doing things that the people on that land or their own parents and uncles were not doing. I think it comes about from people discussing, okay, what do we have here? What is our terroir like? Well, Etna's not really southern. I mean, our climate on the north face especially is very Piemontese. It's very much of a cool climate. And I think with this new generation, these are people who've traveled, who've been to, so when they've been to Piedmont, right? They've been to these quality areas. So it's not just like, well, this is what my neighbor does, this is what that neighbor does, but it's like, okay, I've seen Burgundy, I've seen, Piemonte, I've seen these places that have developed cultures of excellence, and what can I take from them to bring back here to interpret my own territory? And, I think that's where things get really exciting.
Italian Wine Podcast, part of the Mama Jumbo Shrimp family.
Right, of people really reinventing themselves, but also the regions in which they're born and raised, coming back with global perspectives and bringing fresh approaches. How do you think, Robert, you obviously were born in New York and worked in journalism in the U.S. for many years. How do you think we can translate these stories effectively to U.S. consumers, especially in a time when options can seem unlimited in a wine shop, as well as not just wine, there's cannabis, there's other things that people are partaking in when it comes to recreation. How do you think we take some of these stories, these niche regions, and really translate them to today's consumer for the U.S. market?
Okay. And before I answer that, I wanted to add one little thing to the previous question, if I may.
Yes, please.
And that is that I think one of the biggest changes that's happened in Italy and throughout the wine world is that for the previous generations, wine was a source of calories. I mean, it was really you talk about the Mediterranean diet, and it was like bread, and workers in the South would get like a kilo of bread and a liter of wine. And that was their kind of daily sustenance. And I think it's gone from that, not all at the same time, but in stages, from a source of calories to a source of pleasure. And so I think in that way, adopting modern tastes, we don't need the calories anymore. If anything, people are running from them. We lead more sedentary lives, so people are searching for different things in a wine, elegance, pairings with certain foods.
Experience, right? People looking to be transported sometimes to a memory they might have had from a trip, or maybe discovering a new region through a bottle.
Right. I would say very roughly to your very last question, which was how do we interpret that and sell that? You said the word experience. And I think that's really the future. If you talk about Italy, to me, Italy is, one of the most beautiful countries in the world. They need to do a lot of work on that, not take it for granted, not, allow litter and cigarette butts in certain cities, blah, 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 even the center of Verona. I'll get my pitch in there. But I think that when people touch a place, it leaves lasting impressions on them. And I think the same is true for vineyards, for the wine country here, just as it is for, seeing the incredible architecture, from Roman times. And so I think when you experience that kind of like Italian regional life, which Italy really is a collection of regions, it's not really a country, even, it's truly a collection of regions. But I think when someone goes to a typical trattoria, which can be hard to find these days, in Rome, and you drink like a bottle of Cesanese, I think you take that experience home and you want to recreate that experience. And I think Italy is just abounds with those kind of experiences. I talked about rosé before, but I think it was the same thing, even though I mock, Provence rosé and blah, blah, blah. People go on, they would go on vacation in the south of France. They have this bottle that's reflecting the sunset, the light, and, they're in a good mood. They taste it by the sea. And then they go home and they're like, it's Friday night. And, that's what they want to open and share with their friends, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that recreation of that memory, as we know, too, so many Americans are traveling to Italy, and not just now to, the Rome, Florence, Venice, but, your Puglia, right? We've seen this huge influx of tourism in that region, Sicily, of course. So being able to translate, those experiences back to what they're purchasing when it comes to wine, hopefully that carries through.
Right. Now, you mentioned Puglia. I think that there are regions that have super strong identities, like Sicily, Tuscany, etc. Puglia, for me, it's a big, vast region with a lot of production, but they need to work on integrating the experiences and the culture. I would say Puglia has a very under-cultivated wine culture.
What do you think they could be doing better, or how do you think they could approach or look at as a region better integration of culture into the wine industry there?
I'm not quite sure, but I know when I go to Puglia and when I go to a restaurant often, good restaurant, good food, by the sea, blah, 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 you open the wine list. It starts, as many wine lists do in Italy, with champagne, because Italians adore champagne. But then normally, like in Tuscany, it would say, okay, these are our local sparkling. These are our local whites. These are our local reds. And then these are the other regions of Italy, blah, blah, blah. Often in Puglia, you go into the restaurant and they've got like, okay, well, here are the Tuscan wines and here are the Piemontese wines. And then at the end of the wine card, you've got some local selections. So that's not good. I think that Puglia has some very interesting underdog grapes that haven't really been cultivated. Hasn't been enough of a scene quite yet. And I think that some of the wines like the Primitivo di Manduria can be a little bit, heavy on the palate to most people. I know they're working on, Primitivo to do, some different things. Primitivo from other areas like Gioia del Colle is maybe it's more in touch with maybe my taste. Less alcoholic, less ripe, more, seeking freshness. And so I think Puglia's got amazing potential. I don't want to poo-poo it in that respect, but I just think there's more work to be done in the subregions and in the communication of that.
That's a fair point, and a ripe opportunity too for the region as more and more Americans are heading to that way to evolve, hopefully, and better capture perhaps the wine culture of that region. But that's interesting, your comment on the wine list, that they're putting the wines even towards the back. So maybe the primary focus for them, they've overdeveloped on the hospitality side in ways maybe other regions haven't, and perhaps have underdeveloped when it comes to the wine, it sounds like.
Yeah. And that's a good point because, I think the wine culture also changes the experience of people. For example, now on Etna, you go into a wine bar, a Sala Maria. You see young people there, tasting the wine, sniffing. There's a culture of young somms that young people are not necessarily leaving for other parts. They can stay there and make a living, which is pretty exciting. They don't have to go to Milan or other points around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Robert, as we wind down, and thank you for all the insights and your thoughts that you shared today. It was a super interesting conversation. We like to do our little rapid fire quiz. So if you can do your best to answer these questions in just 1 or 2 sentences. Question number 1, what is your number 1 tip for mastering the U.S. wine market?
I would say for mastering the U.S. wine market, travel to the U.S. and travel as much as possible around and touch the various markets and talk with people there. Because, I think as you know, Juliana, you lived in California, now you live in New York. And, the difference between the Manhattan market and the Brooklyn market is...
Oh, yeah. Huge.
Like stark. And I think the same would apply from, San Francisco to Napa to the Sonoma to, Southern California. So I think in that same way, as you go out storytelling, be a good listener and go find the story in the markets you want to be present in.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good advice. Absolutely. Question number 2, what is something you might have told your younger self about working in the wine industry, writing in wine?
I think what I would tell myself is there's an exceptional amount of BS in the wine world. I shouldn't be totally negative about that because let's face it, we're in the wine world partly because many of us, because we're romantics and we love that. But we need to keep that healthy dose of skepticism, even in wine, just as we do for other subjects. And, I was thinking about one subject that comes to mind is amphora. There was a time when a winemaker said, "Oh, I'm using amphora." And, if you're with a group of people, you could see their eyes becoming like they were under a spell. And an amphora is just an instrument for making wine. I mean, it's no different than a barrique, a barrel, and blah, 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 but it's evocative. So maybe BS is not the right word, but there's a lot of poetry that, we got to balance that, kind of check that. So that would be my advice.
Healthy dose of skepticism when you're, approaching stories or looking into the industry.
Well, go deeper, more, we get questions. Okay, what does an amphora do for you? Have you tried anything else or is that the only, so it's just important to stay curious and not be mesmerized.
Right. Go beyond the surface. Absolutely. Okay. And finally, you travel a lot. We all do in this industry. Your first response was travel more to the U.S. market. What is one of your favorite travel hacks when traveling for work or for pleasure?
Okay. Well, I travel a lot in Europe, in Italy in particular. And this is kind of a new travel hack. It's a new idea. And it is to avoid UNESCO sites. This is a terribly controversial thing to do because Italy likes to say, well, we have more UNESCO sites than any country in the world, which is true. Italy's number 1. I think that's 150 something and has more than China, which is number 2.
Wow.
But the problem is that the way a lot of people travel now, going to these UNESCO sites has almost become like an Instagram bucket list. And I find that sometimes, and all amazing charm of a place gets lost when the tourist coach pulls up. So I would say always in Italy, get lost, find the place that may not be the 3 stars in the Michelin tourist guide and find the typical spaces that may not be as spectacular and significant to the world patrimony, but, may provide you a little more pleasure because you can experience them in peace. You can hear the wind in the trees. You can hear the chatter of locals. And so that's my advice. Go off the grid.
Get off the beaten track. I love that. Well, thank you so much, Robert, again, for being here today in the Italian Wine Podcast. How can our listeners connect with you and your writing and everything that you're working on?
Check out my column. It runs twice a month in the Wine Spectator. It's called Robert Camuto Meets. So it's free. You don't have to be a subscriber to read that. So go to Wine Spectator for that. And then there's my website that has books and different news and all that, robertcamuto.com. And I'm on all the Instagram, Twitter, blah, blah, blah. Although I'm less and less interested, loving social media. But
all right. Well, thank you again, Robert, for being here on the Italian Wine Podcast.
Thank you, Juliana. Thank you.
Welcome to Masterclass US Market with me, Juliana Colangelo. This show has been designed to demystify the US market for Italian wineries through interviews with experts in sales and distribution, social media, communications, and so much more. We will quiz each of our esteemed guests at the end of each episode to solidify the lessons that we've learned. So sharpen your pencils, get out your notebooks, and join us each week to learn more about the US market.